Every surviving Jedi after Order 66 needed a planet to disappear on, but the safest looking worlds were often the ones that got them killed. Kashyyyk had loyal Wookiee allies, and the Jedi who went there brought the Empire's full wrath down on an entire species. Lothal was quiet for 14 years, until one lightsaber ignition turned it into a military occupation zone. Murkhana was so full of chaos that a Jedi walked through a Republic checkpoint dressed as a mercenary and spent 4 weeks in a warehouse without a single trooper looking twice. Stormtroopers were only one danger: informants, inquisitors, hostile populations, and the Empire's own bureaucratic machinery each destroyed Jedi in completely different ways. Obi-Wan Kenobi picked Tatooine, and almost everyone assumes it was because the planet was remote. But remoteness was not what saved him. In the canon book, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, the Empire ran a formal program that offered rewards to civilians who reported suspected Jedi. On core worlds, most of those tips were probably false, but in the Mid and Outer Rim, where a Jedi could disappear into obscurity, the Inquisitorius treated every report with weight. Roughly 10 years into Imperial rule, Inquisitors reached Tatooine, found a Jedi hiding near Anchorhead, and killed him. The Jedi who relied on distance alone paid for it with his life. One thing kept Kenobi alive, and no other surviving Jedi had access to it. In the Legends novel Dark Lord, Qui-Gon Jinn's Force Ghost revealed to Obi-Wan that the part of Anakin still buried inside Vader connected Tatooine to pain, to slavery, to his mother's death. Vader could not face the memories the planet carried and could never return there willingly. Tatooine offered a second layer of protection that had nothing to do with the Force. The planet's frontier culture was one where residents gossiped about strangers, but never asked direct questions. Under HUD control and filled with smugglers and outlaws, the social code meant a quiet hermit in the desert attracted no curiosity. Even a spaceport worker in the novel cautioned Kenobi that the desert wastes were not as remote as he might think. In canon, Tatooine fell outside direct Republic governance, and the Empire never formally conquered it. Imperial patrols gradually increased over the years, and recruitment offices opened in the major settlements, but the world remained caught between partial occupation and stubborn independence. The Hutts maintained their own justice, currency, and territorial boundaries, and for a Jedi, that dual authority created gaps wide enough to vanish into. The civilian tip program reached the planet, the Inquisitors followed, and without Vader's personal aversion to Tatooine, the Empire's standard machinery was more than enough. If you want to see more videos like this one, a quick subscribe means you will always be first to know. But Vader's trauma was unique. No other survivor had that kind of shield, and someone who needed to vanish from the Force itself required something far more extreme. Because a dark side cave nexus sat beneath its swamp, Yoda chose Dagobah. The concentrated dark side energy created interference that made it nearly impossible for Sidious or Vader to sense a light side presence on the surface. In Dark Lord, the Jedi Knight Roan Shrine acknowledged that Jedi could mask their Force abilities from other Force users, but he described the effort as psychologically draining and impossible to keep up for years, which made Dagobah's natural interference irreplaceable. Dagobah's emptiness also protected against a second kind of detection. The Grand Inquisitor had studied the fighting techniques of various Jedi Masters and could identify former Padawans by the combat habits their teachers had passed down. On Dagobah, there was nobody to observe those habits at all. In the canon comic Darth Vader, Vader himself hunted for Jedi who had taken the Barash Vow, a commitment to withdraw from all Jedi activity and live alone inside the Force. The logic was that a Barash taker would have felt the purge through the Force, but would not have allowed themselves to respond, which meant they stayed in place and became easy to locate. Yoda avoided that trap by choosing a world where the dark side itself hid him, rather than relying on discipline alone. Dagobah had no settlements, no communication relays, no supply lines, and no population. Because the planet that hit Yoda also locked him in place, he spent nearly 2 decades doing nothing. The most powerful Jedi alive could not train a single student, could not send a message to any survivor, and could not even confirm whether the Sith had been challenged anywhere in the galaxy. But not every survivor could afford to disappear from the galaxy entirely. Some needed protection they could lean on, and only one senator in the Empire was willing to provide it. Alderaan was the only planet in the galaxy where a surviving Jedi could count on political protection from someone with real power. Bail Organa was a sitting senator, a founding member of what would become the Rebel Alliance, and one of the only people who knew the full truth about Palpatine. He was willing to shelter survivors, and he had the wealth to do it. Organa had already smuggled Yoda to safety and placed the infant Leia in his own household, tying his family directly to the Jedi cause. But Organa was also one of the most closely monitored men in the Empire. The ISB subjected both Organa and Mon Mothma to ongoing unofficial surveillance on Coruscant. Any Jedi connected to either senator inherited every layer of that attention. In Dark Lord, Palpatine installed a regional governor over Alderaan's sector who required rigorous identity checks for all refugees from former Confederacy worlds. He organized refugee marches on Alderaan's surface, drawing hundreds of thousands of displaced people to the capital. But that same visibility gave Imperial agents a reason to watch every transport arriving or departing. Organa had to play a careful double game, acting as a public advocate for displaced populations while privately sheltering Force-sensitive children the Empire was hunting. He was not the only senator who tried. A Barabel senator named Sanver hid 3 refugee Padawans in his private quarters on Coruscant. When the Inquisitors discovered them, Sanver and all 3 Padawans were executed. Palpatine used this incident to strip all anti-Jedi operations from Senate oversight entirely, giving the Inquisitors the authority to act anywhere in the galaxy without political approval. One senator had tightened the noose around every other Jedi in hiding by trying to save 3. In 0BBY, the Death Star fired on Alderaan, and everyone on the surface was killed in an instant. At least those Jedi had a powerful ally standing between them and the Empire. On Nar Shaddaa, the Empire had no power at all, and that was its own kind of danger. Nar Shaddaa sat in a part of the galaxy the Empire chose not to govern. In Rise and Fall, the Imperial state deliberately avoided administering borderland worlds already under the control of established crime lords. Hutt Space had no ISB field offices, no chain code terminals, and no sector governors submitting reports. Spaceports processed thousands of arrivals each day without recording a single one, and the corridors of Nar Shaddaa were so crowded with refugees, smugglers, and transients that no face stayed memorable for long. In the canon series The Bad Batch, the chain code system required biometric registration for travel from the first days of the Empire, but rolling out that infrastructure across distant worlds took years, and the territory likely never implemented it at all. On Imperial worlds, the person living next door reported Jedi to the ISB long before any stormtrooper patrol arrived. Because the informant system had no apparatus to work through, Nar Shaddaa removed that threat entirely. Not all of the galaxy's underground networks served the Empire though. In Rise and Fall, Bothans forged false chain codes that were implanted into Aqualish by Nautolan doctors. Different species spotted incoming Imperial raids and signal warnings ahead to people they would never meet. A Jedi with the right connections could tap into these solidarity lines for safe passage, false identification, or shelter, and Hutt Space was one of the few regions where those channels ran without Imperial interference. A criminal underworld, however, was not a safe harbor. In the Legends comic Dark Times, the Jedi survivor Das Jenner tried to live in fringe territory and discovered that his combat abilities made him a target. A local syndicate leader noticed his reflexes during a weapons demonstration on a small frontier world and flagged him as extraordinary. A Jedi on Nar Shaddaa who fought too well or moved too cleanly would not be turned over to the Empire but claimed by crime lords as an asset. But crime lords were not the worst thing a Jedi could bring down on a planet, and the group that traveled to Kashyyyk would learn that lesson at the cost of an entire civilization. Kashyyyk should have been safe. The Wookiees had fought alongside Jedi generals throughout the Clone Wars. They knew their forest better than any occupying force, and for a group of survivors searching for allies, it looked like the obvious answer. Instead, it became a death sentence. In Dark Lord, a group of Jedi led by a young knight named Oli Starstone traveled to Kashyyyk hoping to find Master Yoda. The planet seemed ideal. Wookiees had built centuries of hidden evacuation routes through the forest, cached with arms and supplies originally designed to resist Trandoshan slavers. The tree city of Kachiro had turbolifts, landing platforms, and vertical defenses that would have been difficult for any ground force to crack. For a group of Jedi looking to regroup, It was the closest thing to a fortress the galaxy could offer. Before they arrived, the group had already made a critical mistake. From a defunct separatist facility on Jaguada's moon, they used a Jedi beacon transceiver to slice into the temple's database, searching for locations of other survivors. ISB technicians monitoring the beacon room on Coruscant traced the signal, and Vader identified the transceiver code personally. By the time Starstone's group reached Kashyyyk, Vader was already on his way. The Imperial assault on Kashyyyk killed thousands of Wookiees, and hundreds of thousands more were imprisoned or forced into labor that would last for decades. When Obi-Wan learned what had happened, he judged them as reckless. The second coded burst from the temple had been explicit, directing all surviving Jedi to avoid Coruscant, abandon their missions, and go into hiding. Starstone's group had ignored it. In Rise and Fall, the Grand Inquisitor kept the preserved corpse of Jedi Master Luminara Unduli at a prison on Stygian Prime to bait surviving Jedi into rescue attempts. The trap had reportedly worked multiple times before the Spectres encountered it. Jedi searching for other Jedi were not finding allies, but walking into kill boxes. Kashyyyk punished connection itself. Every beacon signal, every reunion, every attempt to rebuild the Order gave the Empire a thread to pull. Lothal would prove that even a single Jedi could bring the full weight of the Empire down on an entire world. Canon Jarrus hid for 14 years before a single choice brought the Empire down on him. Born Caleb Doom, once Order 66 shattered the Jedi Order, he abandoned his name, his lightsaber, and his connection to the Force. He drifted through the galactic fringe running small cons and working freight jobs on forgettable Outer Rim worlds, and Lothal was one of them, a planet with quiet local politics. Lothal's economy ran on farming and small-scale mining, and the Imperial garrison was small enough that most residents went weeks without seeing a stormtrooper. For a freight pilot who kept his head down, the planet barely registered on anyone's scanner. The moment he ignited a lightsaber, his cover broke. On Lothal, discovery did not mean a single confrontation, but a cascading series of Imperial responses. ISB agent Callus identified a Jedi presence among a local rebel cell, and the Grand Inquisitor was dispatched. Additional army and navy units followed, then Grand Moff Tarkin, and eventually Darth Vader himself. Lothal went from a backwater to a war zone in under 2 years. The Empire expanded in waves, and the pretext for each wave were often manufactured. In Rise and Fall, Imperial agents hired smugglers to plant caches of old Separatist weapons on legacy worlds like Samovar and Wadi Rafa. When routine patrols then discovered the weapons, the Senate approved full annexation of those planets on charges of harboring Separatist sympathizers. The charges were fabricated, but they gave the Empire legal cover to strip mine the worlds underneath. Once that process reached a given sector, any Jedi hiding there was exposed to a level of Imperial infrastructure that had not existed a year earlier. On some worlds, the Empire came for something it wanted more than any Jedi. On Jedha, that something was under the ground itself. Jedha is the only planet on this list where the population actually wanted Jedi around. In the canon novel The Mask of Fear, Bail Organa traveled there just weeks after Order 66. Roughly 1 million pilgrims had gathered in the Holy City for a morning vigil, pushing an ancient stone through the streets in a ritual of grief. An admiral walking beside Organa observed that once these mourners returned home, sympathy for the dead would scatter to almost nothing across the wider galaxy. On Corellia, crowds in every city burned Jedi in effigy. Some blamed the Order for betrayal. Others were tired and blamed the Jedi for failing to prevent the war or win it faster. Jedha grieved openly while the rest of the galaxy moved on. Because suppressing 1 million mourners would have required a military response the early regime could not afford, the Empire tolerated the vigil. Jedha's population was large, deeply religious, and connected through pilgrimage routes to dozens of other systems. Palpatine risked turning a contained display of grief into a galactic symbol of resistance if he moved against it by force. In the canon reference The Rebel Files, the Guardians of the Whills possess several combat traditions of their own, alongside a spiritual tradition tied to the Force that predated the Jedi Order itself. A Jedi who reached the Holy City would have found sympathizers willing to shelter them, fighters capable of protecting them, and a spiritual community that still honored the Force. Nowhere else in the galaxy offered that combination. But the Holy City sat on Kyber crystal deposits, and the Empire launched large-scale mining operations on both Jedha and Ilum to gather the crystals needed for both Death Star super lasers. The garrison grew. The Temple of the Kyber was closed, and on Ryloth the same logic was at work, with a Dunium refinery turning a populated world into a resource extraction colony. Some war-torn worlds drew far less Imperial attention. Some were stripped clean and abandoned fast enough to leave a window. But on Murkhana, one Jedi climbed through it in the middle of a battle. 3 Jedi were standing on Murkhana's surface when Order 66 hit, and they were mid-battle when their own clones turned on them. Murkhana was a corporate alliance headquarters world, a separatist stronghold packed with mercenary bands and criminal enterprises that had thrived under the Confederacy. In Dark Lord, crime had flourished there even before the war, with the corporation running tactics nearly identical to those of Black Sun. The streets were crowded with Korrivar merchants, human mercenaries, and the private security forces that had served as its muscle for years. Thousands of armed fighters roamed the city in the days after the battle, many of them unfamiliar to the Republic troops now occupying the landing zones. In that kind of confusion, 3 more strangers in mercenary garb attracted no attention. Roan Shrine's survival in those first hours came down to one decision. He stripped off his Jedi robes, took garments from fighters his group surprised behind the Argente Tower, and disguised himself as a member of the Vibroblade Brigade. Then he stood at the ragged edge of the landing platform and let his lightsaber, comlink, and beacon transceiver slip from his hands into the dark waters below. Republic forces rounded up hundreds of enemy combatants after the battle, and because Shrine carried nothing that could identify him, he was swept into a windowless warehouse with the rest. 4 weeks passed without a single trooper recognizing him. Chaatak, a Zabrak, hid her cranial horns under a brigade headcloth and passed the same way. Starstone, the youngest of the 3, had kept Chaatak's beacon transceiver hidden through forced persuasion during the search, a decision that would eventually lead Vader to track them across the galaxy. But in those first weeks, Murkhana's chaos was the one thing keeping them alive. Because a clone unit had refused to carry out the purge, Vader was sent to the planet personally, and Murkhana was already under direct Imperial investigation. Weeks were all Murkhana could offer. Long-term survival required a planet where the Empire's own indifference ran so deep that a farmer could work the same fields for a decade without ever seeing an Imperial uniform. Salucami was exactly that kind of world. A peaceful Outer Rim farming planet, far from any hyperlane junction or shipyard. Order 66 was carried out there without incident. In the Bad Batch, Vice Admiral Rampart's hologram appeared over the settlements to declare Republic credits invalid and require citizens to register for chain codes. The regime treated Salucami as compliant backwater, worthy of administration but not a garrison. Governors in the Outer Rim rarely visited the worlds they administered, and most settlers lived through a galaxy that had changed its name, but not its rhythms. Rural settlements did not have ISB informant networks or stormtrooper patrols, and a resident who kept to the crops would never encounter an Imperial officer from one season to the next. But the population itself was dangerous. In Dark Lord, Starstone's group visited Salucami and found that anti-Jedi sentiment ran deep across the Outer Rim. Where local communities saw themselves as victims of a war they believed the Jedi had prolonged. A stranger who displayed unusual abilities would draw suspicion from the locals long before any Imperial agent ever arrived. Palpatine had no interest in running the galaxy day to day, and the quality of Imperial control depended entirely on which governor ran which sector. In Rise and Fall, one Moff in the Belderone sector banned Republic credits overnight, rendering the residents of his worlds bankrupt with no warning and no transition period. A different governor might have been lenient for years. Imperial officers had a saying that a soldier's value was measured by proximity to Coruscant. Salucami sat deep enough in the region that this indifference worked in a fugitive's favor. Because Palpatine eventually deemed his hunters obsolete, the Inquisitorius itself had a shelf life, and by the Battle of Yavin they had vanished from the record entirely. Someone who reached Salucami early, kept their head down, and farmed for 15 years would have outlasted the hunters themselves. But there was one option left for those willing to leave the galaxy's map behind entirely. Beyond the Outer Rim, past the fringe of charted space, lay the Unknown Regions. In the Legend sourcebook, The Unknown Regions, hyperspace routes in that territory were not maintained in any galactic chart, navigation data was scarce, and a web of hyperspace interference called the Tangle made entry dangerous even for experienced pilots. Imperial scouts were restricted from freelance exploration beyond the border. Entire civilizations existed there that had never made contact with the Republic or the Empire, and the cost of mapping that territory would have exceeded anything the Empire could extract from it. Patrol ships that ventured too deep risked losing their navigational lock entirely, stranding their crews in uncharted space with no beacon to guide them home. Political dissidents sometimes fled there when even fringe worlds could no longer hide them, and criminals used the territory as a raiding base. It was a last resort for people who had exhausted every other option. Crossing that border as a Jedi meant leaving behind every ally, every supply line, every source of information, and any certainty of ever finding a way home. In Dark Lord, Sidious accepted that some Jedi would vanish this way. He regarded their exile as atonement, a sign that the survivors were humbling themselves before the Sith. He was willing to let them disappear permanently as long as they never organized. Sidious never needed to find every surviving Jedi. He only needed the galaxy to be hostile enough, fragmented enough, and watched closely enough that they could never come back together. But the 10 worlds on this list were chosen for what they could hide a Jedi from. Across the galaxy, planets exist where the environment itself is far more dangerous than any Imperial garrison. What makes them lethal has nothing to do with politics or war, so watch this video to find out.